they diagnosed a brain bleed. So they took him into hospital and they did various tests and whatever, and then the next day he had to go down into theatre to have an angiogram. And he said, when he went, he said, I'm going to be okay. I mean, he was on the ceiling by this point, you know, because he was so drugged up. I'm going to be okay, I'm going to be okay. Anyway, off he went, and he came back, and he went into his room, and he was absolutely distraught. Prior to this, my husband didn't cry. Absolutely distraught. He went into his room, he pulled the sheet up over his head and asked the nurse to ask me to stay outside his room, wouldn't let me in. Well, I'm beside myself. I thought, well, there's something, you know, really serious that's happened to him. They've told him something that, you know, I don't know. Anyway, after about 20 minutes, the nurse came out because he was on like 10-minute neuro-obs. Nurse came out and she said, your husband said you can go in now. And I had a girlfriend with me. And my girlfriend, we had met when she lived in the UK. Her parents are Australian, but her parents had moved back to Australia. She'd stayed in the UK, then she came back to Australia, and her mother had passed before we moved to Australia. So she was a good friend and, you know, good support. So she came in with me and we sat down and I said to him, what's going on? You okay? You okay? He said, I'm just emotionally distraught. I've just had the most weird experience. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, one minute I'm in theatre and the hemorrhage had happened in the part of his brain that affects sight, so he couldn't see very well. Thankfully, he's made a wonderful recovery. But he said he remembers being in theatre, he said, and he could see sort of, you know, monitors, and he could hear people talking. And then he said the next minute, he was in what he describes as a corridor. He said it was a very long, dark corridor. But he said either side of this corridor, there were people that he had lost throughout his life. So there were family members there were friends of his parents that had passed when he was a child. My mum was there, and my dad. The interesting thing was his mum was there. Now at the time, she was still alive, but she was in the UK. So I think there's two schools of thought here. One was either that she was sleeping and she had astral travelled to be with her son at that time, or her soul had decided to travel and be with him at that time because it was what I believe a possible exit point for him. So he said, and they were all clapping. They were all clapping him. He said they were all congratulating him on his success in this life and welcoming him. And he said he felt absolutely euphoric. He said there was no, because he'd been in terrible pain. He said there was no pain, there was no anguish. He was so peaceful, and he said he'd never ever experienced anything like it. It was such a wonderful, wonderful experience. And he said as he was floating down this corridor at the end, where the light is at the end, my mum was standing waiting for him. He and my mum were really, really close. And as he got closer to her, he said he looked at her and she looked at him, and telepathically they communicated, and she said to him, "Are you ready?" And with that, he said he thought about me and our children. And instantly he thought about me and our children. Bang, he was back in the theatre. Mm. The interesting thing was, he said to my friend, he said, "Your mum was there, Linda." So she said, "Oh, was she?" "Yeah, that was her." He said, yeah, Margaret was there. She was wearing a blue dress and had white dots on it. And Well, as my husband is describing what her mum was wearing, she's going paler and paler and paler. He said, yeah, she's wearing this dress and she's smoking a cigarette. So she said, that dress that you've just described is the dress that we buried her in. And she said, when she went, she said, I put a packet of cigarettes and a box of matches in with her because when she was alive the doctors told her that she mustn't smoke anymore and she missed it desperately, so she said, I thought, well, you know what, you can have one now. And she was standing there having a cigarette. And he's been completely different ever since, you know, that the whole thing has just flipped him round. He's completely open, like I am now. You know, he'll say sometimes, God, these conversations we're having, if anybody could hear us, they'd lock us up, you know. But he's much more open, he's much more compassionate, much more loving. I mean, he's always been loving, but yeah, very much more emotional than he ever used to be. Very compassionate.
Do you think it was just a lesson for him?
I think it was a possible exit point for him. And he could have gone, but he chose not to because he needed to be with us. He wanted to be with us. But he has no fear of death now whatsoever, none at all. He's so much more patient, and he says, you know what, every morning I wake up and that's enough.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Good story.